and thank all of you for this wonderful welcome that I have received. It has been a pleasure working with Jennifer and Anne and others in the Society for Asian Art who have done a magnificent job of organizing every detail of my trip and my travel. The only thing they couldn't control was United Airlines that got me in here about 6 hours late yesterday. So other than that, everything was perfect. And this is such a wonderful audience, and I'm really pleased to be here. So thank you all for coming. So, when I was first asked whether I would come and give a talk, I was told that the particular sculpture that we were going to look at was this one. I was also told that the total lecture would be about 90 minutes. And that is when my panic began, because the idea of talking about a single sculpture for that long seemed daunting. But as I started to really work on the paper, I realized that this was a fantastic choice of a work of art, because not only does the subject matter represent the pinnacle of Buddhist thought, but this subject matter and this particular type of image not only was created very popularly in India, but also was exported from India to the rest of the Buddhist world, where it became a major image type. So today I'm going to talk to you about the image, and I've decided to divide my talk into two parts. The first will be before our break, and the second will be after. During the first part of the talk, I will talk in detail about the art object. So we're going to concentrate on the physical features, a description of the subject matter, and the spread of this image type to other parts of Asia. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to focus on the audiences for whom such an image is important. And I will look both at the ancient audience, that is the artists and the patrons and the devotees who would have used this work of art, but also the modern museum and collecting world. I won't concentrate too much on that, but all of us here are looking at this work of art in a context that is quite different from the one for which it was originally made. So I want to explore that. When we talk about the art object, we can use the kind of journalistic questions, the who, what, where, when, why, and how the work of art was made. To some extent, this is, and then I was going to talk about the audiences, which I've divided into the four components. The scholar, by which I mean anyone who wants to study and learn about the work of art. You don't have to be in a university to be a scholar. The creators, the patrons, the devotee, and the museum audience. So when we talk about the work of art, we can begin with the journalistic questions, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And I will discuss these, but not in that specific order. What? It is a sculpture, and it represents, the subject matter represents the Buddha triumphing over Mara. And we'll talk a bit about what it meant for him to triumph, and who was Mara, and why this subject matter became so important. If we want to just simply talk about the work, just as you can talk about a human being according to his or her social security number, well, we can basically say here, this work of art has a social security number right here in the collection of the Asian Art Museum. It's made of stone. It was made in eastern India, probably the region of Bihar, around the 10th century during the reign of a dynasty known as the Pallas, and it was made for the Buddhist religion specifically. It was made around the 10th or 11th century, and this was a high point of Buddhist art in India. There were many high points of Buddhist art in India, but what's interesting about this particular period is it was the kind of last hurrah for Buddhism before it was extinguished from the Indian subcontinent. But luckily, during this particular period, from the 8th to the 12th centuries, there was a tremendous amount of international activity with practitioners of Buddhism from China, from Tibet, Nepal, Southeast Asia, coming to India for the original teachings. And they then brought back to them to their homelands this knowledge about Buddhist art and about the Buddhist religion at that time. So even though the tradition was extinguished in India around the 12th century, it continued to flourish in its children and grandchildren and other descendants in other regions of Asia. So as I mentioned, this image was made in eastern India. I'll show you some maps so that will get you a little bit more familiar with the region, under the reigns of the Pala dynasty. Now, one of the seats of their empire was a place called Bodh Gaya, which some of you may be familiar with because that is precisely the place where the Buddha triumphed over Mara. And during the Pala period, the Pala kings used this idea of triumphing over evil as a kind of symbol of their own reign. So the particular image that we're going to be looking at, we know from inscriptions and from copper plates and other information that survives to the present day, was appropriated by the political dynasty so that it had a kind of dual meaning. One, in the Buddhist context, with Buddha triumphing over Mara, evil, death, and so on, and the Pala kings being the righteous rulers who also triumphed over all evil. So we have a map of the world, and we are here, right? And this is India. In particular, we're going to look at the region of India that is this sort of eastern area. But we are also going to look at how the art tradition of this area was disseminated north into Tibet, Nepal, and so on, into China, into Southeast Asia as well. Whoops. Oh, I did the wrong thing. Okay. This is a map of India showing you the particular sites that form the Buddhist homeland. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that the Buddha that we talk about, who lived in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, was a historical person. He was not a god. And this sometimes seems unfamiliar to people who look at Buddhist art from a Western perspective, because the way in which he is treated, with the respect and the honor and so on, sometimes suggests that he has been deified. But in fact, he is considered a human being who, through his trials and his errors, ultimately came to have this perfect knowledge that made him a Buddha. He was born in actually what is southern Nepal, and he spent most of his life in this region of northern and eastern India. Bodh Gaya, the place where the triumph over Mara occurred, is right here. And over the centuries, this has become a kind of pilgrimage region for Buddhist devotees, to go to each of the places, primarily 8 major places, where the major events of his life occurred. Let's get back to the work of art. The original piece of the original sculpture is in what we might call a stele format. It was intended to be set into an architectural niche in a temple, and it was intended to serve as an instructional and devotional object for the devotees. When we look at just simply the facts of the sculpture, it's chiseled out of fine-grained stone. It's carved somewhat three-dimensionally in terms of the figure. We're going to look at the slides in a moment. And there is a lot of incising of the details. Now, because it was intended to be put into a niche, the sides and the back are uncarved. It is also intended to be viewed frontally. So, for example, and thanks to Forrest McGill for having taken a lot of photos of the image in the gallery, which he sent to me, but you can see that the image is not correctly viewed when we look at it from the profile. In some of Western art, particularly examples of sculpture that are meant to be seen, let's say, in a public garden or some kind of public space, the artist would often make sure that the work would be interesting visually from all sides. But a work like this is clearly intended to be seen from the front. You'll notice that the side, there's a little bit of detail here, but for the most part, the artists have not even polished or finished the sides of the work of art. It was intended to be set into a niche and to be viewed from the front. Here's another view, for example, to show you how incorrect it is to look at it from a three-quarter or from a side view, unless what you're really trying to understand is how the work was made. But the original intention of the artist who made this was that we would see the work from the front. So let's look at the sculpture from the front, and I'm going to give you some descriptions, and then I'm going to go through the slides to show you some of these characteristics. We could be very detailed in terms of simply describing the work. It shows the Buddha, and as we'll talk about, there are many Buddhas in Buddhism. And when we talk about the Buddha, we mean Shakyamuni, the Buddha of our era, who lived around 2,500 years ago in that region that I pointed out on the map. Now, he is seated on a throne, and you can see that there is a carved crossbar at the back. There are rampant lions at the two sides, and beneath the throne there are these kind of uprights, and there are two lions. The presumption is that there would be a third lion here, but there is a tiny little figure who is actually blocking that a particular place. Now, at the very top, we see that there is a cluster of branches of the particular type of tree under which Shakyamuni Buddha triumphed over Mara. So this particular cluster of leaves, which might look unimportant visually when you start looking at the work, is actually critical for determining the identification of the subject. The second feature that is critical is the position of the right hand of the Buddha. And before I change to the next slide, I will also just say that there is a halo behind the head of the Buddha. I'm going to come back to the hand gesture in just a moment. He sits, as you see, in lotus position, something that many people are familiar with due to the current popularity of yoga in our society. But the soles of the feet are upward as they rest on the opposite leg. And we're going to see that there are some details that are carved on the upright soles of the feet. Now, the left hand of the figure is face upward, palm upward in the lap. And that is half of what we would call a meditation gesture. If the figure had both hands in the lap that way, we would say he is in full meditation. And in fact, before the Buddha triumphed over Mara, he was meditating under the particular tree, the Bodhi tree. So it's completely appropriate that we see him half in meditation. But the right hand is in what we call the earth-touching gesture. And as I mentioned, along with the Bodhi tree above, the hand gesture is the other critical detail identifying this as the triumph over Mara. Now, when I tell you a little bit more about the story of the triumph over Mara, you will see that there are many other narrative components. But in the Pala school, the particular 8th to 12th century school of art that we're talking about, for the most part, we really see a quite abbreviated and condensed version of the subject matter with just these key elements. In other examples, we will see many of the accompanying figures who are also part of the narrative. in terms of the appearance of the Buddha, he wears a monastic robe that covers his left shoulder but leaves his right shoulder bare. He wears no jewelry. However, I am going to show you an image type in which he appears with ornaments and a crown, and we will talk about that later. But normally, the Buddha is considered to have renounced the materialism of the physical world, and therefore does not adorn himself with jewelry and other kinds of ornaments as well. And some of you are familiar with his early life as a prince, after which he basically gave up that rich life and decided to pursue the religious path. So his absence of jewelry is considered a sign of his renunciation. And another feature that are part of that renunciation are the extended earlobes, which many of you are familiar with throughout the whole of Asian art in which the Buddha is shown. The extended earlobes are not a feature that he was born with, as are some of the other features. But as a prince, he wore heavy, heavy earrings. And unlike the ones that we have today, even if they're large, they're usually very, very lightweight. In India, these would be made of solid gold and would be very heavy, and over the course of time would distend the earlobes. So the fact that his earlobes are distended but do not wear ornaments is a physical sign that he had enjoyed that wealthy material existence prior to his renunciation. Other features are ones that he was born with. He was said to have been born with 32 lucky or auspicious signs on his body when he was born, including a golden-colored skin, arms that reach down below his knees, which you can't tell in a figure like this because he's seated. But also normally included is the ushnisha, the protuberance on the top of the head, and then the urna, which is a mark in the center of the forehead. Now, the Buddha isn't the only one who has these marks. You will sometimes see them on bodhisattvas and other figures as well. But his special character was such that he had all 32 of these marks. And included among these marks are the inscription of Buddhist wheel on his feet, the soles of his feet, which we will see in a moment with a better slide. In this and in many images, the eyes are half closed as if in meditation. And other features on this particular sculpture include an inscription here, which we'll talk about later, that is the so-called Buddhist creed, and I'll explain what that is a little bit later also. And then there's an inscription right down here that gives the name of a donor, Prajna Prabha, and we're going to also talk about that a little later when we talk about the artist and the patrons. Now, most of the time when you hear people talking about Buddha images, they see the image as something that's highly conceptual. I believe that the images are truly intended to be a portrait. No one was there with a camera at the time the Buddha lived, so no one could take the kind of picture that we could take today of, let's say, the Pope or another important religious figure, the Dalai Lama. And the images, first of all, I think in terms of the literature, are always talked about as being accurate renderings of his physical being. So one of the things that I will talk about a little later is that I do feel that these are intended to be portraits. However, there are characteristics that we don't normally find in an ordinary human being. But that's not because they were not considered to be authentic, but rather because he was so special. So we find, for example, the use of visual metaphors, and I have a better detail that I will show you. His torso was so perfect that it didn't look like a normal torso. Today, of course, people might say it's a six-pack torso that's ideal. But in this particular school, it looks like the face of a cow. The nipples would be the two eyes, and then this little roll of flesh down here would be the lower part of the snout of the animal. So his appearance has features that are comparable to other things rather than human beings, but they are still intended as portraiture. Now, we're going to talk in detail about the overcoming of Mara. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the Pala school, for the most part, does not include a lot of detail other than the key points. This took place under the Bodhi tree, and the triumph occurred when the Buddha made this particular earth-touching gesture with his right hand. But in other examples that we will look at, we will see Mara, who is the personification of death. We will see his beautiful daughters, who are sometimes turned into hags at this event. We will see his armies. Sometimes you will even see the earth goddess beneath the hand of the Buddha, because when he reached down to touch the earth, he was calling her in to be his witness to his right to become a Buddha. Another important point is that although sometimes people talk about the triumphing over Mara as the Buddha's enlightenment, it's not actually the enlightenment. It's the moment before the enlightenment. It's the certainty that he will become enlightened. And as far as I know, there are no examples in Buddhist art that actually show the moment of enlightenment. So let's look at the image in detail. We've talked about a lot of the characteristics. And for example, here, this shows you the inscription at the bottom. This little figure could be the donor monk. Sometimes they are considered to be the person who donated it. Sometimes they are considered to be a devotee. And I don't know if we can be certain, but it could certainly be the person who donated it. We've got the lions, we've got the hand. And when you see the hand in detail, you can see another feature that is characteristic of the Buddha, and that is that he had webbed fingers and toes. Now, most of us would just be hysterical if we woke up one morning and found we had webbed fingers and toes. But actually, it is a physical characteristic, and in his case, because it's so rare, it is included among the special characteristics that indicated that he was no ordinary person. We have the halo with the inscription of the Buddhist creed, and then you can see the Bodhi leaves, which I'll talk about in a moment. Half-closed eyes, Urna, Ushnisha. His hair, by the way, is in what are often called the snail shell curls, which after he renounced the royal life, he cut his hair, and supposedly it formed these curls and never grew again. And you can see his distended earlobes as well. The rendering of the Bodhi leaf is very specific. This is a Bodhi leaf that we have a Bodhi tree at home in a pot, and I took one of the leaves, and you can see that it has almost a heart-shaped form, and the rendering is really quite accurate. Again, just a closer view of the image. This is the torso as the cow's face torso. And here you can see the inscription of the motifs on the soles of the feet, and I didn't mention it, but on the hands as well. And among the 32 marks that indicated that the Buddha was special at the moment of his birth were these inscribed wheels on his hands and feet. And the wheel, as some of you know, is a symbol of the Buddha's teachings eventually. In Southeast Asia, in Thailand, and in Burma in particular, the Buddha's footprint becomes a major artistic motif. And often these soles will be embellished with all kinds of things besides the wheel. There will be lotuses, Mount Meru, all kinds of things. But this would be the basic wheel on the soles and the palms. Another detail of the lion and the inscription. Some of the detailings of the carving, which, as you can see, is very, very precise. This is a very beautiful work of art. It's been carved impeccably and really very, very beautifully. Detail of the inscription. Other side. What does it mean to be the triumphing over Mara? First of all, there are different versions over time and in different regions of Asia. But basically, the story is one of the 4, or it can be 8, major events in the life of the Buddha. And it is a turning point in the spiritual progress of the Buddha. He was not born enlightened. He was born into a wealthy family. His father was a king. His mother was a queen. And when they took this special child to see the astrologer after he had been born and had these 32 special marks on his body, they were told that this child will either become a great king or a great religious being. Well, like most parents, they were hysterical at the thought that their child would not follow in their footsteps and, become a king and so on. And so what they decided to do was prevent him from being exposed to any of those things that might provoke him into the kind of philosophical thinking that would lead him in a religious direction. But they failed, and really ultimately he left his parents' home and embarked on a journey that lasted some 6 years before he became enlightened. And he made mistakes like other people did. He fell in with the wrong crowd, but ultimately came to become enlightened. Now, he was born in an era in which there was no living Buddha to teach him. So he discovered this on his own, and then his legacy is that he created the monastic community so that others could be taught the same thing. So the moment just prior to his nirvana is what we see in the triumph over Mara. It took place at Bodh Gaya, as I mentioned, and it took place on an auspicious day, the full moon, in the month of Vaishaka, which is also an important date for many other Buddhist special occasions. Now, Mara is the personification of death. And simply speaking, if you overcome death, you become immortal. Right? If death is an enemy that you can overcome, you are immortal. But when we talk about immortality in the Buddhist context, we are not talking about what the Greek gods might have had, living and playing and having this wonderful time and being immortal. But rather, it means that one loses one's finite egoistic existence and becomes part of the larger universal spectrum, which I will talk about in a moment. But Mara did not want the Buddha to achieve this enlightenment, which we will call nirvana, nirvana would be fine. And so he tries to send everything that he has at his disposal to try to prevent the Buddha, who is quietly meditating under the Bodhi tree, to prevent him from achieving this goal. So he sends armies, weapons, whatever. He sends his daughters, who he hopes will be able to seduce the Buddha into not achieving this spiritual perfection. And he sends various other weapons and uses other tactics at his disposal. But the Buddha is completely undeterred by this assault on him and the assault on his senses. And we don't see it in the Pala example, but I will show you some other examples where the weapons, that is, the arrows and other weapons that are being hurled at the Buddha, are turned into flowers by the Buddha. So he is not only undeterred, but he is able to understand and transform the evil that is coming at him into something much better. But in order to prove his worthiness, he touches the earth and asks the earth goddess to witness his right to attain nirvana. Now, you may also be familiar with the fact that the Buddha, like all of us, is considered to have lived many, many, many lives in the past. And we'll talk about this in a few moments. But what we will see is that in the case of the Buddha, in each of his past lives, whether he was an animal or a human, he did something that was so meritorious that it gave him a higher birth. In the birth prior to the one that we see him here, the story is called the Vishvantara Jataka, and it is the one in which he perfected generosity. He was so generous as a king, he gave away everything that he owned. And so that becomes the merit that he had achieved. And he calls the earth goddess to witness that in his past lives, he had done everything he needed to do and was ready to achieve nirvana. Now, Mara was quite a character. He was a family man. He had 500 children. I don't know if he knew all their names, but three of his sons were Confusion, Pleasure, and Pride. Please do not name your children or grandchildren Confusion, Pleasure, and Pride. He had three daughters named Discontent, Craving, and Lust. And these are the three daughters who are sent to try to tempt the Buddha from his resolve. Now, the three daughters try to help their father. They're good daughters, and they want to do what he asks of them. And because they understood that all men do not like the same kind of woman, they transformed themselves into many different forms, hoping that one of them would do the trick and would deter the Buddha from attaining his enlightenment. One version of the story says that they also transformed themselves into hags because even this might appeal to the Buddha. There are other versions of the story that say that to punish the daughters, the Buddha transformed them into hags, but later changed them back out of his compassion. But there's a lot of debate as to whether the Buddha, this guy was not petty, right? At this point, when you're achieving nirvana, the last thing on your mind is to be petty and turn these girls into hags. So a lot of traditions discount that particular story. What did the Buddha understand when he achieved nirvana, and what did he teach then in the years that followed? The name of the Buddhist religion doesn't come from the name of the Buddha himself. I know in Christianity is called Christianity because Christ was the Christ. But here, the name of the religion really comes from the inherent concept of the religion, which is the goal of becoming awakened or enlightened. Enlightenment is the common term that we use in English to explain what happened, but I personally prefer awakened because enlightenment sounds like someone turned on a light bulb. Oh, I get it now. Awakening means you have all of this inside you, just ready for you to awaken and understand. And that's really more what the process was that the Buddha underwent. Now, there are many awakened or enlightened beings in Buddhism. Again, a common misconception is that the Buddha is the only one. But in history, he is considered to be the seventh of a group of 8. An eighth one is supposedly on its way. Sometimes he's the third of 4. Sometimes he's the 23rd of 24, and so on. And there are other types of enlightened beings, for example, bodhisattvas. All of you are familiar with Avalokiteshvara, Guanyin, Kannon, whatever the name would be, Chenrezig. And that type of being, a bodhisattva, is also fully enlightened. And the Buddhist ideal would be for everyone to be enlightened, and not just human beings, but all sentient beings. So the goal of Buddhism is for all sentient beings to become awakened and thus be released from samsara. So we'll talk about that in a few moments. What did he really understand when he became awakened? In Buddhism, the ultimate goal is to overcome what we might call the cherishing of our own egos. Most of what we do is egocentric in the way that we feel hungry, we have to get some food, we need some sleep, or our desire is to do some particular thing with our career, or whatever it would be. And we see the world from our own perspective. But as we all know, if you see the world from someone else's perspective, it can change dramatically. So the goal of Buddhism, and what wisdom really is making you understand the world from all the perspectives that are possibly out there, and not just your own. And I always like to give the example of a car that's painted red on one side and green on the other. And that car is involved in an accident. And all of the witnesses on the red side said it's a red car, and all the people on the green side say it's a green car. They're both right in what they saw, but not correct in establishing the correctness of the whole. So in Buddhism, what you are really trying to do is to get out of just viewing the world from your own perspective. And that is perfect wisdom. But the other component of being enlightened is perfect compassion. Because you can have this perfect wisdom and understand all of these different viewpoints. But if you don't have compassion, you might never take action to do something about it. At the same time, if you have perfect compassion but not wisdom, you may not know where to place your compassion and how to really help all of others. So this nirvana is the combination of wisdom and compassion, which ultimately means that you have overcome the cherishing of your own ego, and you understand the nature of the universe itself. As I mentioned, there have been many historical Buddhas according to Buddhist literature, and potentially there will be many, many others. Hopefully everyone, whether a human or an elephant or another type of sentient being, will all become perfectly enlightened and perfectly wise and perfectly compassionate. Buddhists believe that we are living in the world of samsara, and this is the world in which we are born, we live, and we're reborn, depending on the karma that we have accrued. Karma is a system of retribution, meaning that if I do something bad, I will pay for it in my next rebirth. It might be that I am a jewel thief, and I am never caught, and I live in luxury for the rest of my life. Karma, that scorecard, will give you the retribution that you deserve in your next life. And what about that good deed you did, and no one noticed it at all? That's on your karmic record as well. So it is the sum total of all of the things you do, the good and the bad. When the Buddha taught, he taught what is considered the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And you can see from the Four Noble Truths that basically life is seen as something that creates suffering because we have attachments And when we have attachments and there is loss, we suffer. So Buddhism doesn't correct the situation of loss. It doesn't say you will never have loss again. But it helps you understand in the larger picture how this is and how it comes to be. So the Buddhist path is essentially one that teaches you to deal with your cravings, your desires, your attachments, and to rise above them. And to do that, you follow the Eightfold Path. Now, the Eightfold Path is quite different from something like the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments specifically tell you, do not kill, do not covet thy neighbor's wife, and so on. It's a list of things you should not do. What are right views? What are right intentions? What's right speech? What's right action? These are really very difficult questions. And so the Buddhist really has to figure things out as he or she goes. For example, something like right action. Now, normally we would all agree that it's not good to go out and kill someone. But if killing someone, like someone, a mass murderer or whatever, will save the lives of many others, maybe that is a choice that one has to make. So the issue is not that there's a set list of rules you follow, but rather that you try to figure out, it's very difficult, the best thing to do in various situations. So on the whole, Buddhists practice what we would call non-harm, ahimsa. It's pacifistic, it's environmentally concerned, it's commonly vegetarian, and so on. These are considered non-ego cherishing. And because of these kinds of principles that it is, it's really very much a practice that is appropriate to the modern world. And we find that although Buddhism began and first flourished in India and then traveled to Asia, the rest of Asia, it is now also a very commonly practiced religion in the West, in Australia, in Europe, in North America, and so on. Back to our map. So I mentioned that this art was important not only in its own right, but also that it traveled. I'll try to talk for about 10 or 15 more minutes, and then we'll take our break. The event that we've been talking about, the overcoming of Mara, occurred at Bodh Gaya. If you go to the site today, this is the temple that you will see there. But of course, it was not there at the time that the Buddha was alive. There's a walkway that marks the place where he paced up and down after his enlightenment. But the most important object at that site is the Bodhi tree. The one that is here is considered to be a descendant of the original one that the Buddha himself sat under. The original one was said to have survived for really 1,000 years when it was then destroyed by an evil king in India in about the 6th century, and then it was renewed with a planting from Sri Lanka. I don't know whether all the historicity works out in terms of how long the Bodhi tree would live and so on, but in any case, this tree is considered to be the descendant of the original one at the site. When I first visited it many, many years ago, there was no railing or fence around it, and you could touch the tree and so on. When you go there now, they obviously don't want everyone touching it. But I've also been there at dawn, and one thing that's really interesting is that over the night, leaves will have fallen. So the people who get there first thing in the morning are the ones that grab some of those leaves. And so it's a very special kind of thing. Here's another view where you can see people gathering to pay their respects to the tree. And then this is a seat that was put there in the 3rd century BCE, supposedly marking the place where the Buddha sat. So he would have faced that direction. Here's the tree. His back would have been here. And then the temple is built in front of the place where he supposedly sat. Here's just another view of the leaf. It's important to note that the leaf did not become important just at the time of the Buddha. The motif is one of the very few recognizable plant motifs that we find in prehistoric India. And we find it on a tablet from around 4000 BCE and on a ceramic. And when we find it in that prehistoric context, it seems to be a symbol of rebirth, because it is often painted on pottery that was used in burials. So it's very rare to find plant motifs in this early art, and that this one is identifiable suggests that when the Buddha chose to sit under the tree, it already had a very, very lengthy a collection of beliefs that were in place. We find many works of art in which the tree is shown, such as here, growing out of what may have been an early temple that originally surrounded it. Another example showing the tree with the seat where the Buddha had sat. And then another showing the temple itself. Now, if you go to the site today, this is the image that you will see. It's a very large image. It's about 3 meters high. Probably not the original one inside, but as you'll notice, it does the earth-touching gesture, the left hand in the meditation gesture. It's from the same period as the sculpture that we're looking at today that's in the Asian Art Museum collection. And this image, whichever the original was, probably became the model for the thousands of examples of Pala period representations of the Buddha triumphing over Mara, such as the one that we see here. And one of the things I actually wanted to talk about was that it was part of the life events. I'm going to actually skip over some of this, but here is from the Gandhara region, 2nd, 3rd century, a panel that shows the birth, the overcoming of Mara, the first teaching, and the death. So just to put it in context, that this is one of the life events, the birth, the overcoming of Mara. And in this example, you do see, here's some of the soldiers who are being overcome, some figures who are throwing weapons like a big rock over here, these animals and demons who have their swords and so on. So this shows you the same scene, the same subject, but in a more elaborate form. And I'm going to actually skip over some of these other life scenes that I wanted, that I would have talked about, but I want to bring up this idea again, to develop this idea that the theme is such a major component in Buddhist art. It's not the first time that the subject is shown when we see it in the Pala period. Here's an example from about the 5th century at Ajanta, which is very interesting because, as you'll notice, the hand is palm out. This is a mistake. An artist simply got it wrong. But there's no question that this is the scene, because we see some of the daughters below, and we see the weapons and the armies attacking the Buddha here, and we see him seated under the Bodhi tree. We find manuscript paintings in which, in the Pala period, the same subject is shown. This is an example of fragment that shows some of the demons who would be attacking, the demons of Mara attacking the Buddha. And another important thing is that we often find that they are part of a group of the major life events. This is a halo, and the central figure is actually missing. It would have been the Buddha in the earth-touching gesture, surrounded by other scenes, the birth, and other of the 8 major events. Now, I'm actually going to move through this. I put in way too much material. It's a common flaw. But I just want to show you that the Pala image that you're looking at today is one variation on a very popular theme from this period. For example, here's another example in the Asian Art Museum collection, very similar to the one, but you'll notice that the base is different, the detailing here is different, we don't have the rampant lions. And this also has two other Buddha figures shown. Another one in the Asian Art Museum collection. It has the rampant lions, but the style is very different. And there are two Buddhist stupas up above. And this one includes the earth goddess, who you can see here, and she is holding a water vase, which is one of her symbols. So there are many, many different variants that we can see. And I'm not going to spend time on any of these, but excuse me, I can show you example after example after example after example. The central Buddha with two side bodhisattvas, central Buddha. After example, and so on. All of these belonging to the same period, but some of the different regional styles. So the subject matter was one of the major life events of the Buddha. It appeared in art prior to the Pala period, but with the Palas, particularly because the kings adopted this as a symbol of their reign, it became so extraordinarily important that my personal photo collection probably has 1,000 examples of Pala period, the Buddha triumphing over Mara. But don't be worried, the one in your collection here is fantastic. It was also made in metal, and then, as I mentioned, we also have some examples in which there is a crown. And it begins, as you'll see, to take on a variety of different symbolisms. In this case, the historical Buddha is merged with Vairochana, who represents all that is eternal in the universe. I'll go on for 4 more minutes, and then I'll give you your break. Another one with a crown. Another one with a crown. And I did want to just very quickly talk about the fact that the Pala style, which we saw developing here, and Bodh Gaya being of such central importance, ultimately exported this imagery to Nepal, to Tibet. Well, it did go to Bhutan. Of course, Bangladesh was part of this. Burma and Thailand, Indonesia, and China. It did eventually reach Korea and Japan, but not directly from the Palas. And I'm just going to quickly show you, for example, this is also in your collection here. Your catalog lists it as Indian, but I believe, I'm one of the believers that this actually is from Burma. And in this case, we see a lot of subsidiary scenes along with the central scene. Burma, Thailand, Nepal, Tibet, Mongolia, China. So we could, and I could have shown you thousands of examples. This becomes one of the most important subjects in Buddhism. And why not? It represents the pinnacle of what the Buddha achieved. We also find it in paintings, some of which are very, very elaborate. Paintings I'm showing you are primarily from Tibet. This is a wonderful carving. It's in a modern Bhutanese temple at Bodh Gaya. And what's wonderful about this is you see the daughters of Mara, and they're turned into hags, and then beautiful again. So we see the hags. I guess, I'm still attached to real life enough that I prefer not to be a hag. But it's just a wonderful, detailed example. But in each of these, you'll see, although the central image is the same, there is a tremendously rich iconography and a tradition that goes with it. So I'm just showing you. The 8 famous sites are also associated with stupas, so that's what we see here. Here, the Buddha is shown in the temple. The daughters are here again. Here are the 3 daughters again. So these are much more elaborate than what we see in the Pala. One of them here is a hag. But the thing is this, the Buddha didn't tell the difference. It didn't matter to him. He was so above all of this. More and more examples, and this is a wonderful one. It's a fairly modern Nepalese example, and you can see that as the weapons come towards the Buddha, they turn into flowers. Wouldn't that be nice if any time something horrible happened to us, we just turned those weapons into flowers? So I'm almost finished. This just has some details. The daughters again, the weapons, daughters. And many of these, again, are tremendously complicated iconographically. And so the image type that we're looking at today fostered its own kind of idiom of imagery throughout Asia. And this is a wonderful example showing life of Buddha. And at the very top is the overcoming of Mara here. And this is from Dunhuang. Okay, but this is really a weird way that the gesture is shown. And the armies. So, to summarize the first part of my lecture, it's a key subject in Buddhist art. It came to symbolize the kings, and it was transported elsewhere where it thrives to the present day. So, thank you for your patience.